The sea had taken many things from me over the years: friends, crew, even pieces of myself. But it had never taken my sense of duty. A captain's burden is the lives of others, and every decision weighs heavier when those lives hang by a thread. I'd made mistakes before, the kind that leave scars no storm can wash away, but I'd always sworn to put my crew and those in need above all else. That's why I answered the distress call, even though it came from the Bermuda Triangle, a place where sailors vanish and reason unravels. I didn't trust the call, but I trusted my purpose, to bring people home, no matter the cost. The distress signal came 3 days ago. A luxury liner, Starfall Horizon, stranded deep within the Bermuda Triangle, had stopped responding to all communication. The passengers were reportedly taken hostage by a group of pirates. Maritime law and duty made it my job to intervene, but this wasn't my first brush with the strange and treacherous waters of the Triangle. I knew better than to trust a simple explanation in this cursed expanse. The Aegis, my ship, was a sturdy rescue vessel, built for enduring rough seas and hostile situations. As we approached the coordinates, a strange silence blanketed the crew. The liner should have been visible long before we reached it, but the dense fog clinging to the horizon seemed determined to keep it hidden. Finally, as a dull glow crept across the sky, the Starfall Horizon emerged from the mist. The ship was eerily still. No passengers waved for help, no signs of the chaos we had prepared for. Its massive hull leaned slightly to one side, and streaks of a dark, slimy residue trailed from its deck down to the waterline, giving the impression that the ship itself was bleeding. Macklin, my first officer, leaned toward me as we stood on the bridge. His face was as tense as I'd ever seen it. "That doesn't look like pirates." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't." We tethered the Aegis to the liner and prepared a boarding party. The rescue team armed themselves, protocol when dealing with potential hostiles. But I could sense their unease. This wasn't a mission anyone wanted to be on, least of all me. Still, leaving those passengers to their fate wasn't an option. I led the team across the bridge connecting the two ships, the groan of metal beneath our boots unsettling in the stillness. The liner's deck was slick with a pale slime that seemed to shimmer faintly under the weak light filtering through the mist. It clung to everything. The railings, the floor, even the air felt heavier, filled with the acrid metallic tang of decay. "Keep close," I said to the team, motioning for them to move toward the bridge of the liner. The ship's bridge was empty. The controls were still active, though smeared with more of the strange slime. Static crackled from the communication systems, but no human voice emerged. I checked the logbooks, flipping through pages warped and sticking together, but the last entries offered nothing useful, just routine reports before everything stopped. "Captain, over here." One of the team called, his voice laced with urgency. He was near the entrance to the main stairwell. I joined him quickly and saw what had caught his attention. The walls were streaked with pale, slimy tracks, running in uneven patterns as though something had been dragged, or had dragged itself, through the corridor. The substance pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, as though alive. "What the hell is this?" the crew member asked, stepping back from the trail. I shook my head. "Something's wrong here. This isn't just a hijacking." Macklin joined us, his expression grim. "Where are the passengers? Even if the pirates ran, there should be bodies." "Or survivors," I said. "Let's check the lower decks." Descending into the ship's depths, the air grew colder, and the strange, sour smell intensified. The tracks became more frequent, branching out in seemingly random directions. Some led into rooms, the doors of which were coated in slime and sealed shut. The crew exchanged nervous glances, but I pushed us forward. Whatever had happened here, I needed answers. The source of the distress call turned out to be a makeshift barricade in the ship's dining hall. Tables, chairs, and metal scrap had been piled high, blocking the entrance. On the other side, I could hear faint movements, rustling, scratching, and the occasional, quiet shuffle of feet. "Break it down," I ordered. It took a few minutes, but we finally breached the barricade. Inside, we found a group of passengers, perhaps a dozen, huddled in the far corner. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes wide and sunken as though they hadn't slept in days. Many were wrapped in blankets, their clothes stained with grime and slime. They didn't look relieved to see us. They looked terrified. "You're safe now," I began, stepping forward. "We're here to help." A man at the front of the group, middle-aged with streaks of sweat matting his thinning hair, shook his head. "No one's safe," he said, his voice shaking. "Not from that thing." "What thing?" Macklin asked. The man gestured toward the ceiling, where the slime seemed to thicken, branching out like veins. "It came from below. We thought it was the pirates at first, but they're gone now. It's still here." The passengers shrank back at his words, their fear palpable. "What is it?" I pressed. "What happened to the crew?" Before he could answer, a sudden screech echoed through the hall. The sound was high-pitched and unnatural, reverberating through the ship like nails dragged across metal. The passengers whimpered, some covering their ears, others clutching each other tightly. "Get back to the Aegis, now!" I barked to the team, gesturing for the passengers to follow. As we ushered them toward the exit, the screech sounded again, this time closer. The corridor outside the dining hall seemed darker, the lights flickering and casting strange shapes across the walls. The slime on the floor had grown thicker, clinging to our boots and slowing our progress. We hadn't made it halfway back to the connecting bridge when the first sign of movement stopped us cold. A figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the hallway. It was humanoid in shape, but grotesquely distorted. Its pale, translucent skin revealed dark veins pulsing beneath the surface, giving it an almost unnatural glow. Its limbs were unnervingly thin and twisted, with claw-like fingers that seemed to twitch independently. It moved with an erratic, insect-like rhythm, its eyeless head tilting unnaturally toward us, as if perceiving the world through senses beyond our comprehension. For a moment we were frozen, unsure if what we were seeing was real. Then, it let out a guttural clicking sound, followed by a burst of speed that defied logic. It charged toward us, its claws scraping the walls as it moved. "Fire at it!" The crew opened fire, the deafening sound of gunfire filling the corridor. Bullets struck the creature, black ichor spraying from its wounds, but it barely slowed. One of the crew members panicked, turning to run, but the creature was on him in seconds, slamming him into the wall with enough force to dent the metal. "Fall back," I ordered, forcing myself to stay calm as we retreated toward the bridge. The passengers screamed as we passed, some refusing to move until Macklin physically dragged them forward. As we reached the connecting bridge to the Aegis, I glanced back one last time. The creature stood at the far end of the corridor, its head tilted as if studying us. Slimy tracks glistened in its wake, and the faint glow beneath its skin pulsed faster, like a heartbeat. It didn't pursue us, but somehow, that made it worse. We sealed the door behind us and made it back to the Aegis. My crew scrambled to tend to the survivors, but I couldn't shake the feeling we hadn't escaped. The creature wasn't just hunting us, it was spreading. Back on the Aegis, the tension was suffocating. The survivors were huddled in the mess hall, pale and silent, as if speaking might summon the horrors they'd fled. My crew worked quickly, setting up quarantine protocols. The slime tracked from the liner was already being scrubbed from the deck and equipment, but I wasn't sure it was enough. Macklin stood beside me, his face grim. "We should cut them loose, Captain. Burn the starfall horizon and be done with it." I stared at him, my jaw tightening. There are lives on the line. And how many lives do we risk by bringing that thing with us? He jabbed a finger toward the survivors. "You saw it. That wasn't human." He wasn't wrong, but I wasn't ready to abandon the people we'd rescued, or the mystery of what had happened. Something had brought that creature aboard the liner, and I needed to know what it was before we left this cursed stretch of water. "Seal the survivors in quarantine," I said, my voice firm. "No one in or out until we know what we're dealing with, and scrub every trace of that slime from the ship." Macklin looked like he wanted to argue, but he held his tongue. Instead, he gestured toward the corridor leading to the medbay. "Dr. Esteban's looking at one of them now. You should see this." The medbay was eerily quiet when I entered. Dr. Esteban was hunched over his workbench, his gloved hand steady as he examined a sample of the pale slime under a microscope. A young man, one of the survivors, sat trembling on the examination table. His skin was clammy, and his breath came in uneven huffs. "Doctor?" I said softly, stepping closer. Esteban didn't look up. "Captain, this substance, it's alive." "What do you mean?" He leaned back from the microscope, his expression grim. "The slime isn't just residue. It's teeming with microscopic organisms, almost parasitic in nature. They latch onto cells and begin altering them." The survivor on the table groaned, clutching his stomach. Esteban turned toward him, his face lined with concern. He was fine an hour ago, just shaken. Now his temperature is spiking, and his veins are discoloring. I stepped closer, my eyes narrowing. The man's skin was taking on an unnatural pallor, almost translucent. Dark veins spiderwebbed across his arms, and as he moved, I noticed a faint shimmer beneath his skin, like something was shifting beneath the surface. "Restrain him," Esteban said sharply. "Quickly." Before I could react, the man let out a guttural screech, his back arching violently. His eyes rolled back, and his limbs spasmed as black ichor began oozing from his pores. The air filled with the sour, metallic stench I'd smelled on the liner. "What's happening to him?" I demanded, grabbing restraints from the nearby tray. "He's transforming," Esteban said, his voice tight. "Whatever's in that slime, it's taken hold of him." We managed to strap him to the table, but the man thrashed with unnatural strength, the metal groaning under the strain. His jaw stretched wide, his teeth sharpening into jagged points. His hands curled into claws, and his skin began to split, revealing patches of the same pale, resin-like substance we'd seen on the creature aboard the Starfall horizon. "Get back!" Esteban shouted. The man tore free of the restraints with a horrifying roar, his body snapping upright. He lunged toward us, but I grabbed a scalpel from the tray and slashed at his arm. Black ichor sprayed across the floor, but he barely reacted, his glowing veins pulsing faster. I drew my sidearm and fired. The gunshot echoed through the room, and the creature collapsed, black resin pooling beneath it. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then its body began to twitch, the resin hardening around it like a shell. "We need to burn it," Esteban said urgently, his voice shaking. "Now." We incinerated the body. The smell of burning resin and flesh lingered in the air long after the flames had died down. I turned to Esteban, my stomach churning. "How long before the others start showing symptoms?" He hesitated. "I don't know. But if even one of them is infected, this entire ship is at risk." I returned to the quarantine area, where Macklin was overseeing the survivors. The passengers were seated on the floor, their expressions vacant. One woman rocked back and forth, muttering under her breath. Another man stared at the wall, his fingers twitching. "They don't look good," Macklin said quietly. "A few are showing fever symptoms. You need to make a call, Captain." I looked through the reinforced glass at the survivors, my mind racing. These people were terrified, broken. But how many of them were already compromised? How many were carriers for whatever horror had taken hold of the ship? I turned to Macklin. "Seal the quarantine zone tighter. No one gets in or out without my authorization." "And then what?" he asked. "Wait for them to turn into monsters?" "We'll isolate the infected," I said, though the words felt hollow. "Esteban's working on it." Macklin didn't argue, but the doubt in his eyes was clear. As night fell, the Aegis seemed to grow quieter, though it wasn't the calm of safety. The silence was heavy with tension, broken only by the faint creak of the ship and the low hum of the engines. I sat in the dim light of my cabin, staring at the ship's logs. But my mind kept drifting back to the creature I'd seen, its translucent skin, the shimmer beneath it, the slimy tracks it left behind. It wasn't just a predator. It was an infection, a contagion with intent. A sudden knock at the door jolted me. Macklin entered, his face pale. "We've got movement near the quarantine zone." I followed him to the security station, where the surveillance monitors displayed the corridor outside the sealed room. The slimy tracks we'd seen aboard the liner were spreading, snaking along the walls and floor. The survivors inside moved restlessly, their bodies twitching as though in response to something we couldn't see. And then, on one of the monitors, I saw it. A pale figure, about the size of a human, creeping along the ceiling. Its spindly limbs moved with insect-like precision, its eyeless head tilting toward the camera. A faint shimmer rippled beneath its translucent skin, and as it turned, I saw the glow of its veins pulsing steadily. "Is that the same one?" Macklin whispered. "No," I said. "It's another." The realization hit me like a wave. The creature wasn't just hunting us. It was breeding. The discovery that there was more than one of those creatures sent a ripple of dread through the crew. The ship seemed to shrink around us, its narrow corridors and confined spaces pressing in like a trap. The thought of those translucent monstrosities prowling unseen, leaving their slimy trails as they hunted, unnerved even the most battle-hardened among us. Macklin and I stood in the security room, watching the grainy footage of the new creature creeping along the ceiling near the quarantine zone. Its movements were eerily precise, its limbs clicking faintly as it navigated the resin-slicked walls. "We need to kill it before it gets to the survivors," Macklin said, gripping the edge of the console so tightly his knuckles turned white. "And if it already has?" I countered, my gaze fixed on the screen. Inside the quarantine room, the survivors moved restlessly, their skin pale and glistening. One woman was hunched over in the corner, her body shaking violently. The others gave her a wide berth, their fear palpable even through the monitor. Macklin frowned. "We can't let it spread." I nodded. "Arm a team. I'll go with you." We approached the quarantine zone cautiously, our boots sticking to the resin-coated floor. The stench of decay hung heavy in the air, mingling with the acrid tang of burnt metal from the earlier firefight. Slime trails crisscrossed the corridors, faintly pulsing in the dim light. They weren't just tracks. They were spreading, forming intricate networks that seemed to crawl as we watched. "Eyes up," I whispered. "It could be anywhere." The creature struck before I finished speaking. It lunged from the shadows, its eyeless head snapping toward us with unnerving precision. One of its spindly arms struck the nearest crew member, sending him crashing into the wall. The creature hissed, its translucent skin shimmering as its glowing veins pulsed faster. "Open fire!" I shouted, raising my weapon. The corridor erupted in gunfire. Bullets tore into the creature, black ichor spraying as it screeched and writhed. It moved with inhuman speed, climbing the walls and darting between us with terrifying agility. Macklin took aim and fired a clean shot through its torso, and the creature collapsed with a sickening wet thud. Its body twitched, the resin around it hardening into a shell as the glow beneath its skin dimmed. "Is it dead?" one of the crew asked, his voice trembling. "Not for long," I said. "Burn it." We doused the creature in accelerant and set it alight. Flames roared to life, consuming its body and filling the corridor with thick, acrid smoke. As the resin melted away, the slime coating the walls seemed to recoil, its faint pulse fading. "Good work," I said, though my relief was short-lived. "Let's check the survivors." Inside the quarantine room, the situation was worse than I'd feared. The woman who had been shaking in the corner was now on the floor, her body convulsing violently. Black ichor oozed from her mouth and eyes, spreading across the floor around her. The other survivors backed away as far as they could, their faces twisted in a mix of horror and revulsion. "We can't help her," Esteban said quietly, standing near the door. "She's too far gone." I crouched beside her, watching as her veins darkened and her skin began to stretch unnaturally. The faint shimmer beneath her flesh had grown stronger, the glow pulsing in sync with the slime spreading across the room. She wasn't just infected, she was transforming. "Get the others out of here," I said, standing quickly. "Now." Macklin moved to guide the survivors out, but as the door opened, the woman let out a guttural screech. Her body arched, her limbs twisting as claws tore through the ends of her fingers. She lunged toward us, moving with a speed that belied her deteriorating form. I raised my weapon and fired on instinct, the shot striking her squarely in the chest. She crumpled to the ground, dark ichor spilling out and spreading across the floor in thick, glistening pools. Even then, she didn't stop moving. Her body convulsed violently, and the resin began to seep outward, encasing her in a cocoon-like shell that seemed to grow with a life of its own. "Seal this room," I ordered. "No one goes inside." Back on the bridge, Esteban delivered the grim news. "This isn't just an infection. It's a life cycle. The parasites start small, microscopic, but they use the host to grow and mature. Once the transformation is complete, they emerge as those creatures we've been fighting." "And the slime?" I asked. "It's part of the process," he explained. It's alive, spreading spores and preparing the environment for the parasites to thrive. If we don't stop it, the entire ship will become a breeding ground." I glanced at the monitors, where the slime continued to spread across the ship. It was no longer just a nuisance. It was taking over. "What happens if one of those cocoons finishes forming?" Esteban hesitated, then said, "It will hatch, and the creature inside will be stronger than the ones we've faced." The alarms blared as we prepared for the next stage of the fight. The crew armed themselves, flamethrowers and accelerants replacing their standard weapons. The quarantine zone was sealed off, but the slime had already begun spreading through the ventilation system, and faint, clicking sounds echoed from the lower decks. "They're multiplying," Macklin said grimly. "We need to get to the source." He was right. The slime was emanating from the cargo hold, where the luggage and other supplies from the Starfall horizon had been stored. It was the perfect breeding ground, dark, damp, and untouched since the transfer. If we didn't stop it there, we wouldn't have a ship left to save. We descended into the cargo hold, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. The resin coated the walls and floor, forming grotesque patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Cocoon-like structures hung from the ceiling, their surfaces pulsing faintly. The sound of dripping slime echoed through the cavernous space. At the center of the hold, we saw it. The largest cocoon yet, nearly the size of a small car, pulsated with a sickly light. Slimy tracks led to and from it, and the air around it seemed to hum with energy. The resin here was thicker, harder, as though protecting the structure within. "That's it," Macklin said, his voice low. "That's the source." "Set the charges," I ordered, keeping my weapon trained on the cocoon. "We end this now." As the team moved to place explosives around the hold, the cocoon began to split. The pulsing light intensified, and a low, guttural sound emanated from within. I raised my weapon, my heart pounding as the first spindly limb emerged from the crack. The Parasite King had arrived. The cocoon cracked open with a sickening sound, the hardened resin splitting to reveal the creature within. The Parasite King emerged slowly, almost deliberately, as if savoring the moment of its arrival. It was smaller than I'd expected, about the size of a human, but there was nothing remotely human about it. Its pale, translucent skin shimmered faintly, the glow of its veins pulsating in rhythmic waves that seemed to draw the light from the cargo hold. Its limbs were unnaturally long and spindly, ending in sharp, clawed fingers that twitched with unsettling precision. Its eyeless head turned toward us, tilting as if listening. Beneath its stretched skin, something shifted, a ripple of movement that made my stomach churn. "Stand back," I shouted, my voice echoing through the hold. The creature stepped forward, its clawed feet making faint clicking sounds against the resin-coated floor. Slime oozed from its body as it moved, leaving a trail that pulsed faintly, as though alive. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of needle-like teeth glistening with black ichor. A low, guttural sound emanated from its throat, resonating through the air like a living vibration. "Charges are set, Captain," Macklin called, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to move." The creature let out a shriek, a sound so piercing it felt like it was clawing at the inside of my skull. It lunged with terrifying speed, its limbs snapping toward us like the legs of a spider. I fired instinctively, the bullet striking its translucent flesh and sending sprays of black ichor across the resin-covered floor. But the creature barely faltered. It moved with an insect-like rhythm, jerking and twisting to avoid the worst of the fire. "Focus your shots on its core," I shouted, aiming for the faintly glowing veins beneath its skin. The crew opened fire, their weapons roaring in the confined space. The Parasite King screeched again, its movements becoming more erratic as it dodged and lunged. It grabbed one of the crew members, its claws sinking into his torso, and hurled him across the hold. He hit the wall with a sickening crunch, his body crumpling to the floor. Macklin stepped forward with one of the makeshift incendiary devices, activating it with practiced precision. A torrent of fire roared to life, engulfing the creature and illuminating the resin-coated walls in a fiery glow. The Parasite King recoiled, its translucent skin bubbling and splitting under the intense heat. Yet it refused to back down. Instead, it emitted another ear-splitting scream and lunged, its claws cutting through the air with deadly intent. I tackled Macklin out of the way just as the creature struck, its claws carving deep gouges into the resin-coated floor where we'd been standing. "Get up!" I barked, pulling him to his feet. The creature turned toward us, its eyeless head tilting again. The pulsing light beneath its skin grew brighter, faster, as though it was feeding off the energy of the room. The slime coating the walls began to ripple, spreading outward in a wave that made the entire hold feel alive. "Captain, we need to blow it, now!" Macklin shouted. "Set it off, Captain." I hesitated, my gaze darting to the rest of the crew still scattered around the hold. The Parasite King lunged again, its movements impossibly fast. I rolled to the side, the detonator clutched tightly in my hand. My breath came in ragged bursts as I struggled to find an opening. The creature loomed above me, its claws raised for a killing strike when a blast of fire caught it in the side. One of the crew members, bloodied but alive, had picked up a flamethrower and was pouring flames into the creature's exposed core. "Do it, Captain," he bellowed, his voice straining against the chaos around us. I pressed the detonator. The explosion was deafening, a thunderous roar that shook the entire ship. The cargo hold erupted in fire and smoke, the force of the blast hurling me backward. I hit the ground hard, the air driven from my lungs as heat and light engulfed the room. The Parasite King let out one final ear-piercing shriek before its body was consumed by the flames. The resin-coated walls cracked and crumbled, the slime boiling away as the fire spread. When the smoke began to clear, I forced myself to my feet. The hold was unrecognizable, a charred, smoldering ruin. The cocoons hanging from the ceiling had been incinerated, their contents reduced to ash. The slime was gone, leaving behind only scorched metal and the faint smell of burning resin. The Parasite King was dead. Back on the bridge, the surviving crew gathered in silence. Macklin leaned heavily against the console, his face pale but determined. "The readings are clear," he said, his voice hoarse. "No more movement. It's over." I nodded, though the weight in my chest didn't lift. We had survived, but at what cost? 3 crew members were dead, and the survivors from the Starfall Horizon were quarantined indefinitely. Dr. Esteban confirmed that the infection had been eradicated, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only scratched the surface of whatever nightmare had taken hold of the Bermuda Triangle. "We're leaving," I said finally. "Set a course for open waters, and log this in the black box. If anyone ever finds this ship, they need to know." Macklin nodded, but neither of us spoke as the Aegis moved away from the wreckage. The sea swallowed the debris behind us, the mist rolling in to obscure our path. I stared out at the water, my thoughts weighed down by the lingering sense of what we had left behind. The Parasite King was dead, but the slime, the infection, the creatures, they weren't just random horrors. They were part of something larger, something far older and more terrifying than I could imagine. And as much as I wanted to believe we'd left it behind, a part of me knew the triangle wasn't done with us yet. But that was a worry for another day. For now we were alive. And for a captain, that was enough.